what you are about to hear is not mild advice to comfort your ego or a fleeting motivational phrase. This is an uncomfortable and profound truth that has the power to permanently alter how you live, love, and understand yourself in this year of 2026. The greatest spiritual alchemy you can perform now is to gather your vital energy, focus entirely on yourself, and immerse yourself in absolute silence. Don't do this to punish the world. Don't do it to escape your problems, and certainly not to feign an indifference you don't feel. Do it because the essence of your spirit has been poured out and wasted on barren lands that have never honored it. You know this is true. You feel this loss of energy in the invisible weight you carry in your soul every day, in that persistent emotional fatigue that no night's sleep can cure. Why do you feel this uncontrollable urge to explain yourself whenever something bothers you or when someone walks away? Why is there this intense need to justify your choices, your limits, and even your own pain? This automatic impulse to speak and constantly try to prove your worth doesn't stem from love. It stems from an ancestral fear. It's the deep fear of not being chosen, of not being enough, and of being abandoned to your own fate. Carl Gustav Jung, the great investigator of the mysteries of the human psyche, warned the world about an invisible danger. What you refuse to bring into the light of consciousness will continue to govern your steps in the darkness, and you, deluded, will call it destiny. As long as you don't illuminate these hidden forces, they will dictate your reactions. The most common way the unconscious imprisons people is through the incessant search for external approval. You speak to feel that you exist. You explain yourself to be accepted, and you give away precious parts of yourself to ensure that others remain by your side. But here lies the first great secret of this awakening. The woman who turns her attention to herself and chooses silence immediately ceases to be predictable. And in unpredictability lies incalculable power. When you stop reacting impulsively, when you cease giving unsolicited explanations, and when you stop announcing your next steps, a profound reorganization takes place within you. Absolute silence is not an empty space. It is the safe haven where your life force stops leaking out. It is the sacred space where your mind ceases to orbit around the expectations of others, and where you finally begin to hear your own voice without interference. This is dangerous, but not for you. This new state of consciousness is dangerous for the fragile structures that benefited from your exhaustion. When you cease words and reaction, a dormant force awakens within you, and your silence begins to dismantle the illusory reality that surrounded you. The invisible web that connected you to the world suffers an immediate shock. Are you truly prepared to discover what will not survive this radical change? What definitely won't survive this radical change are the relationships that fed off your exhaustion and the invisible patterns that demanded your silent submission. Think about your daily routine and remember how many times you smiled when you actually wanted to cry. Recall the countless times you agreed to something just to avoid prolonged conflict, or how you constantly make yourself available to listen to and solve other people's problems, while your own dilemmas scream in the dark without anyone listening. You were molded to be the strong woman, the always understanding friend, the partner who invariably gives in, and the one who carries the weight of the world on her shoulders to ensure people don't drift away. We live in a noisy society that demands you always be on display, always available, delivering precious fragments of your light to warm those who don't know how to produce their own fire. No one taught you the sacred art of preserving your own essence and gathering your energy from spaces where you need to diminish yourself to fit in. Carl Gustav Jung observed this human dynamic with profound intellectual and spiritual clarity. He understood that to survive the cruel demands of the world and ensure our belonging, we forge a social mask, an acceptable and docile facade. The great spiritual danger, however, occurs when you wear this mask for so long that you forget your true face, coming to believe that you are, in fact, this eternally exhausted and helpful character. Many women have fused their own skin to this armor of unconditional kindness and perpetual sacrifice, forgetting who they truly are in their pure essence. But a spirit cannot live on illusions indefinitely, and here a profound and unexpected turning point occurs. When you decide to stop, when you finally gather your energy and refuse to continue playing this role, an invisible crack opens in the structure of your daily reality. The silence you adopt is not merely the absence of words. It transforms into a mystical and implacable mirror, Without your explanations to fill the voids in conversations, without your justifications to soften the flaws and absences of others, the people around you are suddenly forced to confront their own truths and limitations, and many of them will not be able to bear this vision. They will try to make you feel guilty. They will say that you are selfish or distant, simply because they have lost unlimited and free access to your life force. There comes a decisive moment in life when continuing to live to sustain the convenience and expectations of others becomes the worst betrayal against your own soul. This deep discomfort you carry in your chest is not your own fault. It is your higher consciousness crying out for rescue, demanding that you stop trading your peace of mind for crumbs of attention or a false sense of security. Silence, then, acts as the blade that cuts the cords of external dependence. However, the most terrifying and liberating mystery does not lie in how others will react to your new posture. The ultimate challenge awaits within yourself. When the day ends, when the doors close and you finally remove that heavy mask you wore to please the world, who is the woman who remains there, alone, at the center of your being? When there are no more roles to play, do you have the true courage to look into the eyes of that part of yourself that has been silenced and neglected for so long? The woman you encounter in the darkness of that inner room, right after dropping the heavy mask of sacrifice, is almost a stranger. And the first contact with her doesn't bring immediate relief, but a paralyzing terror. There's a curious and scientifically documented fact about absolute silence. When a human being is placed in an anechoic chamber, a space designed to absorb all sounds, the brain, deprived of external stimuli, begins to create its own auditory hallucinations to fill the void. The same improbable phenomenon occurs in your psyche when you suddenly stop talking, explaining yourself, and solving other people's problems. By cutting off the external noise of social approval, your mind goes into shock, and the voices you've repressed your whole life begin to echo. It is at this critical moment that many women give up and run back into the arms of those who hurt them, just to avoid having to listen to their own thoughts. You will feel an almost physical urge to send a message justifying your withdrawal, a feverish need to apologize for choosing yourself. But Carl Gustav Jung left us an invaluable compass to navigate this invisible storm. He taught that spiritual enlightenment doesn't happen when you imagine figures of light floating above your head, but rather when you have the brutal courage to descend into your own hell and become aware of your own darkness. Forced silence is your spiritual anechoic chamber. It will force you to confront your shadow, that secret part that harbors all your unfulfilled desires, your swallowed angers, and your shame of not being loved. Why do you keep justifying exactly what tears your heart apart? Why does forgetting people who don't add value to your journey terrify your spirit so much? These answers cannot be found in long, late-night discussions or in venting to acquaintances. They require sacred isolation. And when you resist the urge to break the silence, something miraculous happens to your mental frequency. Accounts from esoteric traditions and data from modern neuroscience converge on the same truth. Prolonged withdrawal alters your brain waves, decreasing the constant state of alertness and activating deep intuition. Silence ceases to be a suffocating void and becomes an implacable magnifying glass. Without the dust of your words to obscure reality, you begin to see the true intentions of everyone around you. You will notice, with a clarity that is almost frightening, who approaches you driven by genuine interest and who reacts with fury simply because they felt the strings of control were cut. You begin to distinguish with mathematical precision the difference between love, which respects your time, and parasitic attachment, which demands your immediate presence to avoid collapsing. Silence becomes your fiercest guardian, filtering everything that tries to cross your emotional boundary. However, at the exact moment you close the doors of your inner castle and sit on the throne of your own consciousness, the world outside enters a state of denial and despair, because your life force was the invisible nourishment that sustained many illusions. Are you ready to discover what people will do when they realize that the keys to your kingdom are no longer available to them? There is a hidden and inexorable law that governs human relationships, a rule that ancient mystics understood, but that the modern world has chosen to forget. Understand this with crystal clarity. Not everyone is worthy of walking the corridors of your soul. There are people who approach not with a sincere desire to understand your spirit, but with the secret intention of taming your will and draining your vitality. Carl Gustav Jung repeatedly warned about the danger of projecting our light onto those who prefer darkness. Whenever you over-explain yourself, whenever you try to justify your feelings to someone who refuses to listen, you are handing over the keys to your personal power to someone who shouldn't even be allowed to cross your threshold. To materialize this truth, imagine the archetype of a woman, whom we will call Elena. Elena was the personification of continuous giving. She devoutly believed that if she could find the exact words, love would finally blossom, and the chronic pains of her relationships would cease. She explained her pain repeatedly, justified her needs, and sought dialogue until her own throat was dry. She gave her vital energy in the hope of fixing others, without realizing that she was emptying herself. But Jung knew a dark secret. As long as you try to heal the world around you before healing yourself, you will continue to get lost in the labyrinth of others' illusions. Until one day, driven by a spiritual exhaustion that could no longer be contained within her physical body, Elena simply stopped. She made no dramatic fuss, did not use silence to punish anyone, and did not try to manipulate the emotions of those who hurt her. She simply ceased movement. The source from which everyone drank dried up, and Elena's presence retreated to its own center. What happens to an entire ecosystem when the primary energy that nourished it decides, from one moment to the next, to shut down and return to its origin? The universe does not tolerate emptiness. The very instant you suspend your frequency of despair and stop supplying your energy to maintain artificial peace, the invisible web that connects you to others suffers a seismic shock. Jung observed that the true face of the collective and individual unconscious is only revealed when we break the habitual and mechanical patterns of our lives. Sudden silence is not merely a harmless pause, it is a rigorous and merciless test for your entire environment. Without your constant presence to soften conflicts and take the blame, the scenery around you begins to crumble and reveal its true and disturbing architecture. This is where the true alchemy of inner recollection occurs. The energy that previously bled out to the outside world begins to return, drop by drop, to your physical and spiritual body. Silence transmutes from a fragile defense mechanism into an inexhaustible source of power. You begin to feel a dense magnetic presence growing in your chest. The invisible threads of control that others had tied to you begin to break, one by one, dissolved by the sheer force of your conscious stillness. You cease to be a victim of circumstances and become the silent observer of your own reality. However, this magnetic restructuring will not go unnoticed. It is an irrevocable vibrational law. When you raise your frequency, those who operate at a denser vibration will do everything to pull you back down. The masks of those around you will begin to slip and fall, simply because you stopped holding them up with your justifications. But are you truly prepared to withstand the emotional fury of those who depended on your weakness to feel strong and in control? The outside world's response will be swift and often merciless. People will try to provoke you, testing your newfound limits in the hope of eliciting an impulsive reaction, because while you react, they know they still possess it. Others will try to cloak you in the heavy mantle of guilt, demanding that you once again carry the existential weight they themselves refuse to bear. There will be those who call you cold, arrogant, or unrecognizable. And finally, some will simply evaporate like mist under the morning sun. Silence possesses this cutting and definitive magic. It casts a harsh light on those who used you merely to keep warm. You will realize, with a mixture of fleeting pain and absolute relief, that certain bonds were sustained solely by your continued sacrifice. But there is a colossal liberation contained in this inevitable discovery. You no longer need to wear yourself out trying to expel anyone from your sacred garden. Your silence will naturally prune, eliminating what is false and retaining only what is authentic. You will lose people, yes, and this is a necessary step in spiritual purification. The universe is forcing a cosmic reconfiguration around you to make room for the new. While the storm rages outside and people struggle with your newfound peace, an unshakable sanctuary begins to form within. Your energy now belongs to you completely and absolutely. However, the old system of beliefs and relationships will not give up without one last battle, and the impending confrontation will reveal the greatest secret of all about the nature of human attachment. Do you want to discover what the world's final card is in an attempt to shatter your peace, and how you can overcome it once and for all? The last card the world will play to try and shatter your newfound peace is based on a fascinating principle, observed both in modern behavioral science laboratories and in ancient temples of hidden wisdom. There is a documented phenomenon known as the extinction explosion. When an organism becomes accustomed to receiving a constant reward by pressing a button, and suddenly that machine stops working, it doesn't give up immediately. On the contrary, despair sets in. The organism begins to press the button with aggressive, frantic, and insistent force, trying to force the system back to normal before finally accepting defeat. This is exactly what happens in the invisible web of human relationships when you adopt sacred silence. The people around you are used to pressing your emotional buttons. They knew perfectly well what word to say to generate your guilt, what attitude to take to provoke your anxiety, and what punitive silence to use to extract a flood of explanations from you. Your vital energy was their immediate reward. When you cut off that supply, the ecosystem collapses and the resistance explosion begins. Carl Gustav Jung warned that the human shadow is not composed only of our own hidden fears, but also of everything we refuse to acknowledge in the intentions of others. When you cease movement and stop fulfilling your role as peacemaker, the shadows of other people are forced to rise to the surface. It is a disturbing and, at the same time, profoundly liberating spectacle. You will observe three very precise reactions happening around you. The first is provocation. People will try to test your limits with subtle comments or disrespectful attitudes, hoping you will explode. They need you to react with anger, because your fury is proof that they still have control over your heart. If you react, you are back in the game. If you remain silent, their spell breaks and their control evaporates. The second reaction is the transfer of blame. Individuals who benefited from your unconditional kindness will try to convince you that your new posture is cold, selfish, or cruel. They will do this because, without their constant willingness to carry the emotional weight of the relationship, they will have to deal with their own responsibilities, something that terrifies them. The third reaction, and perhaps the most painful at first, is sudden abandonment. You will notice a curious synchronicity. At the exact moment you stop pursuing, insisting, and explaining yourself, some presences simply disappear from your life. And here lies a curious fact about the nature of human attachment that defies our romantic logic. True silence not only reveals who truly loves you, it acts as a revealing fire that brutally exposes those who only used you as an emotional battery. True love possesses a high and stable vibrational frequency. It tolerates mystery, respects your introspection, and waits in quietude without feeling threatened. Parasitic attachment, on the other hand, demands constant noise, daily proofs of devotion, and immediate answers to soothe its own insecurity. When you are silent, you are not destroying healthy bonds. You are redefining the structure of your reality and disintegrating the connections that were artificially maintained by your exhaustion. This transition demands monumental courage, as you will need to withstand social pressure without reverting to old habits. You don't need to write lengthy texts explaining that you are going through a process of inner transformation. Silence loses all its protective magic and energetic authority the moment you try to justify it to those who have no ears to hear. Those who are capable of understanding your essence don't need a thesis on your motives. Those who don't want to understand won't be convinced even if you talk for 1,000 years. The unconscious always hears actions much more clearly than words. You can claim you've learned to respect yourself, but if you continue to tolerate the unacceptable to avoid momentary discomfort, the universe will understand that you are still willing to negotiate your dignity. The true alchemical miracle happens in total invisibility. It is noticed in the way you no longer beg for attention, in the lightness with which you let go of those who wish to leave, and in the firmness with which you refuse to prove your worth. As this storm of external reactions begins to lose its force and people give up trying to tear you from your own center, the battlefield finally falls silent. And it is precisely in this sudden calm, when the voices of the world are completely silenced, that an indescribable physiological and spiritual transformation takes over your physical body. What happens within your own cells when the invisible war ends and your true presence takes absolute control of your existence? When the external war finally ceases and the voices of the world stop invading your mind, an extraordinary biological and spiritual phenomenon occurs in the darkness of your own body. For years, Your nervous system has operated in a state of continuous alarm. You have lived with short breaths, tense shoulders, and a contracted stomach, always ready to defend, justify, or please. But by sustaining the sacred silence, your physical body understands that the unreal threat has disappeared. The chemistry of your blood changes. Cortisol, the stress hormone that poisoned your cells and kept you in a state of flight, begins to decrease dramatically. A dense, healing stillness descends upon your biology. Carl Gustav Jung taught that the body and psyche are not separate entities. They are perfect mirrors of each other. By ceasing the betrayal against itself, your body relaxes deeply because it realizes it no longer needs to fight against its own mind. In this state of profound inner regulation, you finally gain access to what ancient sages and depth psychology call the psychic center, or the self. You cease living on the agitated periphery of your being, where the wounded ego begs for attention, and begin to inhabit the absolute and silent core of your existence. Your energy is no longer wasted in the futile attempt to predict the behavior of others, or to mold reality to fit the desires of others. Instead, this immense energy accumulates in your chest, transforming into an intuition as sharp as a blade. You begin to make slower, yet unwavering decisions. You begin to love with oceanic depth, but without losing a single millimeter of your own dignity. Your walk, your gaze, the tone of your voice, everything changes frequency. The people around you begin to look at you in a completely different way. The disrespectful familiarity of before disappears, replaced by an instinctive reverence, because they realize, without you needing to say a single word, that you are no longer territory that can be invaded. However, pay close attention, because it is precisely at this point of apparent triumph that the narrative takes its most dangerous turn. Just when you finally feel safe and in control of your own universe, one last trap is silently set within your own mind. A subtle inner voice, cleverly disguised as emotional maturity, will whisper in your ear. It will tell you that you need to break the silence just one more time to properly close a cycle. It will try to convince you that you need to have one last conversation to clear everything up, or that you should send a farewell message so as not to seem cruel. Be very careful. This is the last and most lethal card of your old terrified ego. It uses the illusion of empathy to try to drag you back into the chaos of endless explanations and emotional dependence. It tries to make you believe that you desperately need the understanding of others to be able to move on with your life. But the liberating truth, which directly contradicts everything you've been taught about human relationships, is much simpler and more cutting. You have absolutely no obligation to end every story with beautiful conversations. Silence is, in itself, the most perfect and eloquent ending that exists in the universe. Some stories simply end the moment you decide to stop narrating them aloud. Demanding that the other person understand your process of pain or healing is to continue surrendering your sovereign power to them. When you master this illusory impulse and bravely resist the temptation of that last conversation, the internal trap crumbles and turns to dust. Your silence evolves from a mere technique of emotional protection to a higher and permanent state of consciousness. You stop applying silence as a strategy and become the very personification of silence. You fully trust that you don't need to control or convince the external world to be at peace. However, what happens when this elevated state ceases to be a daily effort and becomes your unquestionable nature? How does life unfold for a woman who no longer needs to announce her power, because her mere presence already governs everything around her? When this elevated state ceases to be a daily effort and becomes your unquestionable nature, the silent magic of individuation described by Carl Gustav Jung finally materializes in the physical world. You no longer wake up anxiously wondering whether to speak or remain silent, whether to insist or retreat. Silence ceases to be a defensive shield you erect against the world and becomes the very essence that constitutes you. The painful and exhausting need to be understood by others simply disappears naturally, purely and simply, because you have finally understood yourself in totality. And when you understand yourself absolutely and unwaveringly, external noise loses all authority over your life and your decisions. In daily practice, this transformation changes the texture of your visible reality. Instead of reacting impulsively to a passive-aggressive comment in your environment or to a distant attitude from someone you love, you simply observe calmly. Your silent observation becomes an insurmountable magnetic force. You begin to allow people to reveal exactly who they are, without trying to fix them, save them, or justify their terrible mistakes. If a scenario is not clear and transparent, you retreat with profound elegance. If a relationship requires you to diminish your intelligence, your light, or your boundaries, so that the other person doesn't feel threatened, you leave without looking back, and without leaving an instruction manual explaining your reasons. You accept with profound spiritual serenity that your inner peace is your most non-negotiable asset. Loving yourself at this level requires accepting that many people will fall by the wayside, and the great revelation is that this will cease to be terrifying. The loneliness that once terrified your mind transforms into a creative, fertile, and welcoming solitude. You discover firsthand that you don't need to be surrounded by people draining your energy to feel whole. On the contrary, by stabilizing your vibrational frequency at your own center, you magnetically attract only connections that vibrate at the same level of respect, psychological maturity, and truth that you emanate. This is the true sovereignty of the human spiritual being, living a material experience. In this year of 2026, your greatest and noblest revenge against a world that tried to drain your energy is not to shout louder than others to prove you're right. Your supreme and silent victory is to live so intensely centered on your own axis that the emotional chaos of others cannot even touch the edge of your energy field. You are definitely no longer the woman who always solves everyone's problems, the one who always understands the flaws of others to the detriment of her own needs, the one who eternally forgives the unforgivable for fear of rejection. You have emerged from your own inner abyss as an uncontrollable force of nature, a woman who fully knows the sacred weight of her own words and the healing majesty of her own silence. Centering yourself is not a declaration of war against humanity. It is the most important, profound, and lasting peace treaty you will sign in your entire existence. If this undeniable truth touched your soul in some way today, don't let this rare moment of clarity be lost in the oblivion of everyday life. Subscribe to this channel right now to continue nourishing your mind and spirit with the knowledge that truly liberates you from invisible chains. Like this video right now as a physical symbol and an invisible pact of your commitment to never abandon yourself again. And above all, leave a comment below. Write clearly what you have decided to leave behind from today onwards. You can do this completely anonymously if you prefer, using only one letter or symbol, but materialize this decision in the real world through your written words. Your silent and courageous account may be exactly the spark of light that another woman, somewhere dark in this world, needs to read today to save her own life.